I do want to introduce our speaker today, David Kensinger.
We are in a bizarre situation. I should say more historic than bizarre. If you go back to 1992, when Ross Perot was a candidate, we had a big jump in voter-eligible participation in presidential elections. Okay, most Americans only access the political process once every 4 years. They vote in the general election in a presidential year. Okay? The reason a group like this can be so influential and so successful is because it shows up. In America, a large portion of people don't ever interact with the political system. Now, as regrettable as that is, I also kind of cherish it, because America is a place where everything doesn't have to be politicized. I've been to places where politics is every part of your life. I don't want to live there, neither do you. In America, you really just can go away and say, leave me alone. And part of why I participate in the political process is to protect the right of people to do that. But a good citizen, I think, should vote regularly. But this is a measure of the voting eligible population. So these are persons not disqualified from voting, say by reason of felony conviction, who are over the age of 18, who are U.S. citizens, who are eligible to vote. What percent actually showed up? And ever since the advent of 18-year-olds voting, we saw a big drop in voting eligible participation in presidential elections. That really began to change in about 1992 with Perot. It fell back in 96, barely half of Americans in 1996 who were eligible to cast a ballot for president. Then in 2000 it came up, 2004 it jumped up. You'll hear a lot on the left in the media, but I repeat myself, try and describe Barack Obama's candidacy in 2008 as a big jump in voter participation. Actually, that occurred between 2000 and 2004. It was Bush's reelect. There are a lot of reasons why that's true. The two biggest reasons I think that's true is, number one, technology. That's about when you started seeing social media, when folks started getting cell phones and emails and such, and there were new ways to reach out to people. Second of all, you saw big jumps in the amount of money in politics here. The left likes to say they're against big money in politics. Well, not really anymore, because it started to benefit them. But they also say they're for voter participation. As we've seen more and more money in U.S. campaigns, we've seen more voter participation. And by and large, that's a good thing. So it jumps all the way up to 60% in 04, 61% for Obama's reelect. Unlike Bush, voter participation goes down between Obama's first election and his reelect. It came back up in 2016. And so we were almost to 60% of the electorate voting in presidential elections. And then we saw a big jump in 2020. 23 million more people voted for president than ever voted before. More than 2/3 of eligible Americans voted in 2020. So we're at a time here where more Americans are engaged in the political process as an absolute number and as a percentage than at any other time in anyone living right now. Okay? I want to remind people what happened in 2020. Biden got 81 million votes. He got an absolute majority of the vote. He was the first presidential candidate to get 80 million. Trump got 74 million, which is the second most ever. It's more votes than any other presidential candidate ever except Biden. Voter turnout was the highest in 120 years when measured as a percentage of the voting eligible population. Okay? I want to remind people, as we look at this year's presidential election, how historically, comically, knee-slappingly, laugh-out-loud bad was the media polling on the presidential election in 2020. That deserves to be repeated, okay? According to CNN poll, the Thursday before Election Day, Biden was up 12 points. 12 points. Final polls going into Election Day, CNN had Biden plus 10. New York Times had Biden winning Iowa by 9 and Ohio by 10. ABC and the Washington Post had Trump losing by 17 points in Wisconsin. 17 points! And all had Biden winning Florida. Trump would go on to win Iowa and Ohio easily, recapturing Florida. Wisconsin went to Biden, but by 0.7 percentage points. You are going to be inundated by media polling over the remaining 46 days of this campaign. It is not because I disagree with the results or because I'm for one candidate. I say to you, you should be highly skeptical. It is because, first of all, good science starts with skepticism, be it social science or hard science. You should be skeptical of anything you see. And second of all, because the track record of these folks is awful, just awful. One of Kansas's great treasures is a man named Bill James. Anybody know who Bill James is? Bill James is baseball statistics. If you've seen the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt or the even better book by Michael Lewis, Bill James, who is a Kansan, still lives in Kansas, it's really his thinking and his research that formed the basis of a lot of the theories and the approaches in that book. And he had a new way of looking at and measuring the productivity of baseball players. That was vastly more accurate and predictive than the models baseball had been using previously. He has a wonderful book he writes actually on popular crime, which is his other great passion. True Crime, I think, is the name of the book. And it's about every famous crime case in American history, from Lizzie Borden to OJ to the Kennedy assassination. Amazing book. And he has a sentence that should be stenciled above the door of every social science classroom in the world. It says, "Our capacity for misunderstanding reality is almost infinite." Okay? The number of ways to misunderstand what's going on is almost infinite. Think of it like a math problem, okay? And social science is never as precise as the hard sciences, although it might wish to be. Okay? An old economist friend of mine called it physics envy. It's not as precise as the hard sciences, but it seeks to be. But the fact is, there's only a couple of possible theories that fit all of the available data. There are an infinite number of theories which are disproven, but people might offer anyway. And one of the great sayings of science is, there's nothing more tragic than a beautiful theory slain by an ugly fact. But that's what science is, okay? We have much more polling than ever before. The necessary and predictable consequence of that is we have much more terrible and inaccurate polling than ever before. And because of our ability now to curate our information flow through our machines, you have people largely getting confirmation bias. They're getting the polls that most agree with what they think is happening or what they wish were happening, which is why I believe in public opinion polling. Well done. I made my living at it once upon a time. It's a useful tool, but there's more of it than ever before, and there's more bad polling than ever before. And you've got to approach it with that appropriate skepticism. Okay? Actually, the 2020 election ended up being achingly close. Trump came within 43,000 votes. And this is taking all of the certified election data just as read, not questioning the legitimacy of any of it. Trump came within 43,000 votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That would have produced a 269-269 tie in the Electoral College. They could have been resolved in Trump's favor in the House, or with another 23,000 votes, he could have won the 2nd Congressional District in Nebraska and gotten the 270. So for all that talk about how 2020 was a blowout, it ended up being incredibly close in the Electoral College. The phenomenon, I think, that are causing these bad polling is very simple. Number one, cheap polling is usually worse polling, and media organizations want to pay cheaply. Second of all, for most supposed mainstream media organizations, okay, their business model is no longer what it once was. The business model used to be, you shoot straight, you give the best information, that gives you the biggest audience, you make the most money. You now have audiences which are demanding a confirmation loop. I want you to tell me stuff I agree with that says I'm right, and the people who disagree with me are stupid, awful people. And the organizations that do that sell subscriptions and get eyeballs. And so what passes for the mainstream media now, with most conservatives and an awful lot of independents having dropped out of that feedback loop, is their business model now involves servicing their left of center viewership or readership. And so that's what they feed them on a daily basis. And that's why they've had significant errors in polling in 16 and 20, but they've been errors in the same direction. Okay, polling is an inexact science. What you're trying to produce is a bell curve of data, and you say 95% of cases occur within a standard deviation, which we call margin of error on either side, and 2.5% are outliers here and 2.5% are outliers here. They never read the full disclaimer, which is, this poll involved 1,000 people, its margin of error is plus or minus 3% with a confidence interval of 95%. What they're saying is 95% of cases occur within plus or minus 3% of the mean, and there's 2.5 out here and there's 2.5 out here. That's a good poll. 1 of every 20 good polls is way off. But they shouldn't be off in the same direction all the time. If they're consistently off in one way, there's a problem with the methodology. There's something systemic that's causing it to be wrong. And I think it's partly this feedback loop, as well as, for whatever reason, polls don't capture Trump's strength. Whether it's because people who are for Trump tend not to participate in polls, whether it's because they are less likely voters and don't occur in samples, take your pick. But we've seen 2 presidential elections now in a row where Trump massively outperformed his polling, okay? I have good friends, and some of you know what I'm talking about, who love to offer the latest daily polls showing that Harris is pulling away. And I beg them, can we not make the exact same mistake in the exact same way the 3rd time in a row? Okay, we all make errors, but good science tries not to repeat errors. Money for president. This is how much money was spent by the major political parties, the campaigns themselves, the candidates themselves, and the major interest groups on all sides. It was $450 million in 1996, jumped up to $650, jumped up to $1 billion, jumped up to $1.64 billion in 2008. Okay? Barack Obama did a great thing for America. He destroyed the system of public financing for elections. He raised so much money, no one will ever go back to it. And so what used to be a contest of maybe a couple $100 million on a side is now a contest of $1 billion a side. Okay? One other thing to look at as you're looking at this fall, in the last 2 presidential cycles, the candidate for president who carried an individual state also saw that same party's candidate for U.S. Senate win in that state. It was true everywhere in 2016, for the first time since the adoption of the 17th Amendment, and it was true everywhere except Maine in 2020. There are a lot of U.S. Senate seats this year in competitive presidential states. In fact, almost every competitive presidential state also has a U.S. Senate race. Okay? I did want to point out one other thing still going on in Kansas, a massive shift towards early mail voting. We can discuss the implications of that if you like. Okay? But what we're really interested in, what we came here today to find out is what happens next. And in the words of the great political philosopher Fats Waller, one never knows, do one. I said last time I was here, never underestimate an incumbent governor. Don't underestimate Laura Kelly. She's never lost an election. She spent, about 80% more than anyone's ever spent running for governor before, and she won by 22,000 votes. She's the only 2-term governor in state history never to receive half the vote. In 2024, I'd like to wish everyone happy Election Day. Minnesota, South Dakota, and Virginia start early voting today. Election Day is here. Now, officially, Election Day is November 5th. That is 46 days from today. And I would say that's when the voting stops, except it doesn't. Eligible ballots will arrive by mail 4 weeks afterward, particularly in states like Nevada and Arizona. Things that have already happened this year. Joe Biden was savagely hounded from the race by people who insisted he was for years highly capable, and they won't say why. Democrats retroactively disenfranchised 14 million of their own primary voters to save democracy. Donald Trump was criminally indicted by political Democratic prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions who campaigned on platforms of targeting him to preserve the rule of law. With the active assistance of the DOJ, so we don't use the legal process to target our political enemies. And he was fined $450 million for repaying a loan in a trial overseen by the father of a Democratic fundraiser for the lead prosecutor in his first impeachment. And the incumbent vice president was nominated to bring change. Oh, And people have tried to kill President Trump at least twice because his supporters are prone to violence. Landscape for 2024, only 7 states seriously in play. Okay? North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. There is a wonderful website called 270towin.com. If you're interested in any electoral college scenarios or what happens if who wins what state, go there. That's a half hour of your life right there, just clicking around, seeing what happens. Horse race aggregate national polling is largely irrelevant. Good friend of mine told me that Kamala Harris was running 5 points nationally ahead of Joe Biden. Whee! I tried to point out to them, 22% of Americans live in California, New York, and Illinois. If Joe Biden was only winning California, New York, and Illinois by 12 points, and Kamala Harris is winning them by 30, which a Democrat should, that's 18 points, 0.18, times 22% electorate, 0.22, which is about 0.0396 of the electorate. So just by going from being up 12 points in those three states to being up 30 points in those 3 states, you gain 4 points in a national poll. And it moves you not 1 vote closer to being president. The aggregate national polling is largely irrelevant. Don't bother with it. Fundamental aspect of this election, this is a change election. At the simplest level, every election is usually one of 2 messages. You never had it so good, or it's time for a change. This is a change election. Why? Because according to the Real Clear Politics polling average, if you ask Americans a very simple traditional question, it's been asked by Gallup for almost 90 years, do you believe that things in the country are headed in the right direction, or have they gotten pretty seriously off on the wrong track? If you take all of the nationally available polling data over the last month and you aggregate it and you average it, about 28% of Americans say we're on the right direction, about 61% say we're off on the wrong track. That's a change election. New York Times Siena, in their September poll, asked a great question, I thought. And it wasn't just about generic change, it was very specific. Do you want the next president to make no change from Biden administration policies, minor changes from Biden administration policies, or major changes? No change, 3%. I think they work in the White House. Minor change, 34%, 61% major change. So you have 60% of Americans plus. The country's fundamentally off on the wrong track. You have 60% of Americans plus. I want major changes from the policies of the Biden administration. And you get similar numbers who will respond, in their opinion and experience, the country was stronger, their neighborhood was safer, and they and their family were better off financially under President Trump. And those are the fundamentals of this election. And given that, voter dissatisfaction centers around cost of living and public safety. Why is the challenger candidate not running away with this? If I took the names out of it and I just told you 60% of people think the country is going on the wrong track, 60% of people want major changes from the policies of the incumbent administration, and 60% believe they were better off under the previous administration, and oh, by the way, the candidates are the previous president and the vice president of the incumbent administration, which cards would you rather play? Which side of the table would you rather be sitting on? And those are still the fundamentals of this election. But I do believe there's enough polling to say Trump is not running away with this election. Okay? So what are the reasons that could be? Number 1, the polls are off. Maybe he is winning handily. Number 2, he has unique candidate weaknesses. I think that's fair to say. Number 3, the establishment candidate is defying gravity. She's in a place now where she can't maintain. She's above where she'll finish. Or, and we have to determine this to the extent to which this is true, the challenger candidate is viewed as part of the change people want, or they want to change from the challenger candidate because he's been part of the national landscape for 10 years. But that's why I take the New York Times wording specifically. That was specific to Biden administration policy, not just change generally. Elections for the U.S. Senate. Republicans need a net gain of either 1 seat plus the vice president or 2 seats overall to achieve a bare majority. West Virginia and Montana look very promising. West Virginia is probably home and dry. Republicans will pick up that seat. That puts them at 50. The Republican candidate in Montana is pretty consistently running about 2-3 times the margin of error ahead of the Democratic incumbent. But to give you an idea of the environment we're in, Chuck Schumer announced this week that in order to try and preserve the Democratic Senate seat in Montana, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee would be spending an extra, now this is on top of what they were already planning to spend, was going to spend an extra $45 million in Montana. There are 46 days left in this election. There are 1.125 million human beings in the state of Montana. That's men, women, and children. There's about 2.4 million cattle. But think about it. Think about the 4th Congressional District here in Kansas, okay, represented by Ron Estes. Yay, cheap applause line. About 725,000 people live there. The whole state of Montana has about 1.125 million. And forget what the campaign is spending, forget what the Democratic Party was already spending, forget what all their affiliated groups are spending. The Delta, they're shoving in an extra 45 million in chips for the last 7 weeks of the election. We've never really seen spending on this scale before in American political history. Now, I am comforted by the fact of remembering what happened in Kansas in 2020 against Senator Marshall. Joe Biden never came to Kansas, never ran a commercial in Kansas, and he got 570,000 votes. Barbara Bollier, the Democratic candidate, raised and spent every bit of $30 million in Kansas, most expensive campaign in Kansas history. She got about 1,700 more votes than he did. So you have a Democratic Party which has more money than it's ever had, more money than any political organization's ever had in the history of the state of Kansas. It just doesn't have issues, voters, or districts, or as many as it wishes it did, okay? In Kansas, close contest for legislative supermajority. It's worth noting how party norms have been redefined. I am old enough to remember when Kansas Democrats were in a majority in the House of Representatives. It happened twice within my lifetime. I'm old enough to remember when Democrats talked about having a majority or challenging for a majority. It is possible that the Democratic Party, come January, has maybe 2 more House seats than it has now. They would have 42, Republicans would have 83. If this happens, it will be treated as the greatest political achievement since the Magna Carta. Coming out of the 2008 election, Kansas Democrats had 47 seats. I think it was 49 in the Kansas House of Representatives, okay? We had the 2010 election, they went down to 33. That was the lowest they'd been since the advent of one-man, one-vote maps in 1972. 33 seats in the Kansas House. In 2012, they stayed at 33. In 2014, they went to 28. In 2016, they went from 28 back up to 40. And they threw a parade. We gained 12 seats to be 9 seats below where they were 8 years previously. And from 40, they've stayed essentially put since then. So between 1972 and 2008, we never elected a Republican supermajority in the Kansas House of Representatives. 19 elections, 38 years, not once. Since 2010, we've done it 7 times in a row. The Democrats believe if they can defeat that by the barest margin, that's success. We're working to make sure that doesn't happen. A lot of important things going on here in Johnson County to make sure it doesn't happen. But even if it does, it's worth noting how party norms or definitions of success have changed. You don't have a Democratic Party talking about being the majority party of Kansas anymore. They're trying to elect a governor. They've elected one twice without a majority. And they're talking about having enough of a minority in at least one chamber to where that governor's veto can be upheld. Okay? Democratic financial advantage has reemerged here, but not yet been fully deployed. And Johnson County is ground zero. Okay? I'll close on this, then take any questions. I always like to look at voter registration. I always say trying to tell what's going on in politics by reading the newspaper is like trying to tell what time it is by watching the second hand. Okay? Take a step back, look at the long-term trends. Okay? Voter registration trends in Kansas remain largely positive for the Republican Party, especially outside Johnson County. In 2010, which was our first modern clean sweep election, supermajorities in both houses of the legislature won every federal and every statewide race by at least 13 points. The Republican registration advantage was about 302,000 voters in absolute terms, about 17.5%. 10 years later, it's bigger. It's 360,000, or about 18.5%. And according to the data just released yesterday, it's about 370,000 now, 18.6%. So there's no reason there for Republicans, at least on the basis of voter preference, not to continue to enjoy the kind of success they saw in 2010 and 2014. Those are the questions I had. Yeah, go ahead. You're first.
I think you're jumping ahead of the microphone. The 7 states that are how many of those do you have to win?
Here is the most important thing to look at, okay? And if you spend any time at all on 270towin.com, you'll come to the same conclusion. The most straightforward path for Trump to be elected is North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, okay? If Trump carries the states he carried in 2020, and the only one of those in jeopardy really is North Carolina, that was worth 232 electoral votes in 2020. Good news, people continue to move from blue states to red states. We had a census in 2020. We reapportioned congressional districts, which reapportions electoral votes. If he carries those same states this time, they're actually worth 235 electoral votes. So if he carries North Carolina, he starts with a base of 235. He lost Georgia by fewer than 15,000 votes. 10 million people live in Georgia. Georgia had in 2020 an unbelievable set of rules that favored the Democratic strategy of aggressive postal balloting. And they were put in because of COVID. Almost all of those rules have now been changed by statute, by the Republican governor and the Republican legislature. You're not going to see the same kind of, I'll call it electoral engineering, you saw in Georgia in 2020 succeed in 2024. Okay, that alone, I think, means Trump is in very good shape to carry Georgia. Georgia is the 9th biggest state in the United States. It has 16 electoral votes. So the base was 232. If you hold North Carolina, you hold the base, it's worth 235 now. Georgia's 16, 251. How many electoral votes in Pennsylvania? 19, 270 to win. So if Trump carries the states he carried last time, plus Georgia and Pennsylvania, lights out, 270, okay? Alternately, so think of it from Harris's perspective, she's got to block at least one of those states. She's got to win Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. Trump has to win Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. He could win North Carolina, Georgia, which would get him to 251, Arizona, 262, Nevada, 268, and he loses 270 to 268. So look at it this way. Trump has to carry Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania. Harris has to carry Pennsylvania, Georgia, or North Carolina. And the most important state by far is the only one that occurs on both lists.
Okay, question.
Yeah, can you comment on the Teamsters not doing the Democrat?
You saw the Teamsters did not endorse the Democrat candidate for president. I think it's very instructive. First of all, credit to the American labor movement for listening to their membership. Okay, the American labor movement for a long time has had a leadership much farther to the left than their membership. Credit to the Teamsters for listening to their membership. And it shows what a disruptor Trump is and Trump has been. He has remade the coalitions of both parties in very fundamental ways. If you look at Trump's strength among middle income and lower middle income African Americans and Hispanics, he's running at historic margins for a Republican. He has remade both parties' coalitions in extremely important ways. But one of the ways in which you see that has been the migration of the professional and college-educated class more into the Democratic coalition, and that's a big part of the swing in finance you're seeing. A lot of those individuals, it's not just billionaire liberals, although those have a huge impact. You're also seeing the sort of folks who write checks individually, who write 4-figure checks and 5-figure checks. They have largely migrated towards the Democratic Party.
Hi, thank you for everything. Do you have any insight on how Dr. Reddy and Sharice Davis' campaign's going?
Yeah, it's a question about the 3rd Congressional District here in Kansas. Dr. Reddy, who's the Republican nominee, and Sharice Davids, who's the Democratic incumbent. Again, the amount of money involved. If you go back 30 years, not that long ago, the 3rd District incumbent was a woman named Jan Myers. She was a Republican. She had served in the Overland Park City Council. She was, I believe, the first woman to chair a standing committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. She chaired the Small Business Committee in the 104th Congress. For her re-election in 1994, she raised and spent about $400,000. That's 30 years ago. We had a Republican challenger, very good friend of mine, someone I admire very much, in 2022, who was our nominee, named Amanda Adkins, who I've worked with for a number of years. She was former state party chair. Amanda Adkins, between the money she was able to raise and the money from independent groups and the money in the national party, put about $3.5–4 million on television in the Kansas City market as a challenger candidate. And she got outspent 2.5 to 1. Sharice Davids and the Democratic Party and its allied groups put $10.5 million on television in the Kansas City market. So you have a Democratic Party which almost effectively now does not know financial limits in these federal races. Okay? Now, as the country gets more prosperous, you assume money goes up all around. We're not making more U.S. House seats. We haven't made more since 1929. We're not making more U.S. Senate seats. We haven't made more since 1960. So you've got to assume the amount of money chasing that finite number of public goods is just going to go up. But Dr. Reddy is facing a huge financial hurdle. We have comparatively late primaries in Kansas. Okay, I've done work, we talked earlier about work in Indiana. In Indiana, election day is, the primary is 6 months to the day before election day. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in May. And then election day is the first Monday after the first Tuesday in November. In Kansas, we do it 3 months later. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in August. And with the result that, particularly on the Republican side where we tend to have more primaries, the Republican brand is more valuable, so there's more competition for it. We tend to wake up the morning after the primary with a candidate who's bloody and broke and 90 days from a general election, and you have an incumbent Democrat, this happened in the congressional race this year, who has $4 million in the bank and another $4 million on the way. So just given that financial disparity, I think it's extremely hard to overcome. All right. I'm also, saying what is public record. I talked about Trump disrupting the coalitions of each party. The Republican Party's fortunes from local elections up through federal elections have suffered very much under Donald Trump. We have underperformed in Johnson County considerably since he became the nominee in 2016. It's actually because of that, that's most of what Democrats are banking on to try and break the supermajority. You know how many counties we have in Kansas? 105. 105. Can you name the 7 most populous? Johnson, Sedgwick, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Douglas, Leavenworth is 6th now. Riley is 7th now. Okay? Riley is 7th now. Bigger than Reno County, bigger than Butler County. Riley. Do you know how many? There's 165 members of the Kansas legislature. All right, 40 senators, 125 House members. Do you know how many of those 165 are Democrats with an official voting address not in the 7 most populous counties? They're a Democrat and their official voting address is not in one of the 7 most populous counties. 1. Jason Probst in Reno County. That's it. Well, I think he and possibly Sidney Carlin are the only 2 that have constituents outside the 7 most populous counties. Okay, that's what they're banking on. The extent, we had a joke at GOPAC, a place I was privileged to work for a couple of years. There's nothing wrong with the Republican Party. There's just too many places it doesn't exist. When Bill Clinton was elected governor of Arkansas for the first time in 1978, there were no Republicans in the Arkansas State Senate. 0. And there basically hadn't been since 1876, since the end of Reconstruction. Okay? There are a remarkable number of places in Kansas now where the Democratic Party does not exist. Laura Kelly lost 98 counties, got reelected. Yeah.
The Dems want to dump the electoral college system for obvious reasons, presidency for life. What are the chances of that happening in the next 25 years?
So the question, what are the chances of dumping the electoral college system? 0. That's in the Constitution, and therefore it's got a very high threshold for change. And if you're starting with a system where rural states are intentionally overrepresented in that process, okay, then what? It takes 3/4 of states to ratify a constitutional amendment. Okay, so 13 legislative chambers in the 13 smallest states, theoretically, could block that from happening, and why would they ever vote to diminish their own voice? So I don't see any chance of that happening. There's various scenarios out there for so-called triggers, that if one candidate, the state would pledge its delegates only to the candidate who won the popular vote. I've been an elector. They hand you the ballot, you can do whatever you want. There's no way to bind an elector under our system. So that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Building on your last statement first, how did they ever pass the 17th Amendment to take the votes away from the legislatures and give it to the common people? And what effect will illegal aliens have on this year's election?
Two very important questions. The first was, how did they pass the 17th Amendment? The 17th Amendment was done of a piece with a lot of what were called the populist or progressive amendments. The 16th of which, remember what the 16th Amendment does? It was the income tax. Okay, you weren't allowed to have income taxes in the United States until the 20th century. But that's okay, we just needed it to fight World War I, then it would go away. The 17th Amendment was designed to popularize the U.S. Senate. The original design of Article 1, and by the way, this is very deliberate. Article 1 is the legislative, Article 2 is the executive, Article 3 is the judiciary. Okay? Article 4 guarantees a Republican, or small r Republican, divided form of government for all the states. Okay, the 5th Amendment is how to amend the Constitution. 6th Amendment is 6th article is full faith and credit, and 7 is ratification. Okay. Almost half of the original document describes the legislature and its powers. It is by far to be the most powerful branch of government. Okay. The only reference to checks and balances in the Federalist Papers occurs of a reference of the Senate checking the House, because that's where the primary power lay, was in the legislative branch. And the point of that was they represented different sovereignties. The House represented the people, which is why it was up every 2 years. That's why every tax bill has to originate in the House. But the Senate was to represent the states, which is why senators are only up every 6 years, and why they have the unique power to try impeachment cases and hear treaties and do confirmations and so forth. Okay, so they were designed to be very different places representing different sovereignties. How did they pass it? They sold people on the idea that more voter participation, more transparency was necessarily better. And that occurred at a time when we were extending the franchise. By the way, the 18th Amendment was prohibition. And the idea is so bad, we used another amendment to repeal it in the 21st. So not everything that came out of the progressive era was a good idea. But that's how they passed it. And we're never going back. How will illegal immigrants affect the election this year? Part of the idea of the Electoral College is it keeps a corruption, and I use that word deliberately, it has different forms. It keeps a corruption of the electoral process in one state from bleeding over into other states. Okay, if you had one jurisdiction, if you had one state, which for instance passed a state law which allowed explicitly non-citizens to vote, or allowed children as young as 14 or 15 to vote. If you don't have the Electoral College, every vote that is counted in that state then cancels out a vote cast in some other state, in some other jurisdiction. The Electoral College has the effect of constraining or containing the corruption of the voter list or the voting process in any one jurisdiction. That's one of the advantages of the Electoral College. What will its overall effect be? It's already had a significant effect in that the census, as it is supposed to do, does not count citizens. The census counts residents. So you actually get a bonus in congressional representation and therefore the Electoral College for having resident non-citizens in your state. So it's already had an effect. What effect will it have in voting? I want to be very particular in talking about that, okay? There are a lot of legitimate concerns about the way we cast and count ballots in the United States, okay? I think Kansas is one of the better states on doing it, but far from ideal. But having said that, it's my obligation as a citizen, if I have any evidence of outright election fraud, which is a crime, and say a non-citizen votes, that's election fraud, I have a responsibility to bring that forward. And so I will be proportionate in my comments about election fraud with however much evidence is in my possession, okay? But I want to make a distinction between election fraud and election engineering, which I referenced earlier. Anybody ever seen a movie called The Firm? It's a John Grisham adaptation. Tom Cruise goes to an Ivy League school, joins this firm in Memphis, and he's learning the tax practice from Gene Hackman, who is the senior litigator they have in tax. And Gene Hackman says to him at one point, what is the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion? A, 10 years in prison. B, a good lawyer. C, whatever the IRS says it is. Correct answer is D, all of the above. Similarly, I make a distinction between election fraud, which is a crime. Okay, now Heritage maintains a database of proven election fraud in the United States. Things that are actually litigated under evidence in court and proven. And it really does exist. Okay? I had one friend complain to me the other day, Trump's encouraging people to vote twice. I said, don't worry about it. You told me voter fraud doesn't exist. But election engineering, like tax avoidance, is why good lawyers make so much money. Okay, that you really can do. And Georgia and Arizona and the way they treated postal ballots in 2020 is a perfect example. And there was a very large push led by the Zuckerbucks, $400 million from a private company to change the way we count ballots. I'm trying to imagine the media's response if a conservative company did that, okay? $400 million to change the way we count ballots, which was in response to an emergency, COVID, to try and make that permanent, okay? It's very important to pull back and have appropriate safeguards, all right, on our election system. And I think the issue of illegal immigration helps in people understanding why that's important. That's the effect it's had and maybe one of the effects it will have. Yeah.
Going back to 2020 with Vice President Pence, could he have made a difference?
No. Okay. No, he could not. I mean, the way the system is written, okay, and I'm biased, I'm a Mike Pence guy. Mike Pence did his constitutional duty. He was right, Donald Trump was wrong, okay? That election, once it became certified at the state level, okay, you have three chances to win an election. You can win it on the number of votes cast, you can win it at the administrative process, okay, or you can win it at the judicial level. That's an election contest. We talk about recounts and things like that, that's still the administrative process. Okay, the absolute fail-safe, if all that fails, is a state legislature may allocate its electoral votes, that's happened before in American history, and ultimately the Congress is the judge of the qualifications of electors. There was not enough there, and there was not in the record, to challenge the legitimacy of those electors. Okay, the Trump campaign filed 80 plus lawsuits, they won one. Now it was a good one in Pennsylvania, which required ballots that had not yet been verified to be kept away from ballots that had been verified. You had Democratic election officials who wanted to mix them all together. So if it turned out those ballots weren't legitimate, you couldn't figure out which ones they were and pull them back out. It was an important victory. But it was never established in the factual record that there had been enough corruption of the process to challenge the credentials of those.
The last part, has the Republicans on a national level, have they fixed the problem for the last election?
It's better than it was in 2020. A couple of things happened in 2020. COVID provided the pretext for fundamentally changing the way we voted and for verifying postal ballots in particular. We have pulled back from that in a lot of jurisdictions. The second is Republicans have taken it more seriously. One of the failures of the Trump campaign and the RNC in 2020 is they got out-lawyered as badly as I've ever seen a campaign get out-lawyered, okay? Election engineering is part of the art of campaigns, and they were beaten horribly. Democrats got in and rewrote the rules, okay? There's breaking the rules and there's writing the rules. Democrats were very successful, especially in places like Georgia and Arizona, in rewriting the rules, okay? And now, I know at least in Georgia, to a lesser extent in Arizona, those rules have been pulled back, okay? The other thing we have to look at is you've got jurisdictions, especially in the western United States, like Arizona, Nevada, California, where you're sending out not applications, which is what we've done previously in places like Sedgwick County. We'll send an application to everyone on the voter file and see if they respond and ask for a mail ballot. Okay, we've done that before in Sedgwick County to success. Nevada is sending ballots, okay, actual ballots. You can go into apartment buildings in Nevada and there are, mailboxes that haven't retrieved their mail in months with actual ballots sitting around. It says right there on the outside what it is. That's a nightmare situation. And what you have in California, lawful ballots that are included in the final total, arriving in December, okay? I mean, this process is designed to facilitate citizen engagement. It's also designed to produce a winner. It's also designed to inspire public confidence. And speaking as a member of the public, I don't have confidence when the count lasts 5 weeks and 6 weeks. You're allowing too much opportunity for mischief. Go back and read about the 2004 governor race. What happened to Dino Rossi in Washington State? Absolute travesty.
Yeah.
So, David, look at your crystal ball. November 6th, or 4 years from now, either way, Donald Trump will no longer be the dominant figure in the Republican Party. Where do you see the Republican Party going? Who will emerge? And what will happen to Trump?
I think the way the two parties are diverging now, okay, and parties are supposed to be different, okay, and they represent different constituencies. That's the nature. That's okay. I think you're coming to a place not dissimilar to where the United Kingdom was in the 16th, 17th, early 18th centuries, in that you have a party of the court and a party of the country. You have a party that is largely a party of government and in and around government, and the people who both facilitate and benefit from government. And then you have everybody else. And everybody else is rightly distrustful of the folks who are running things. And by and large, the Democratic Party has become the party of the government and nonprofit sector. And the Republican Party has become the party of just about everybody else. Now, you would expect one of those two to be better organized, okay, and it is. You would expect one of those two to be more disciplined, which it is, because it has to have power to maintain its raison d'etre, okay? I think we're moving in that direction. So I would think a Republican leader of the future would come from outside Washington. I would think they would come from the ranks of the governors or from the private sector. I think it's less likely you're going to see people on the Republican side emerge from the DC morass to be the leader of a national party which is that distrustful of Washington.
As the acting president today, I'm going to put Dave on the spot. Quick question. Ranked choice voting, what's the impact? And especially in places like in Maine where you've got congressional districts, and could we be in a situation November 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th, we won't know who the winner is?
Remember what ranked choice voting is? It's the quick way to do a runoff, okay? The slow way to do a runoff is the way Georgia does it. We have an election on November 5, and if no candidate receives a majority of the vote, the candidates who receive the top 2 places then have a separate election just between the 2 of them. That's a runoff. Ranked choice voting is the fast way to do that, which is, okay, there's 5 candidates on the ballot. You vote 1 for your favorite candidate and then maybe 2 for your second favorite. And if no candidate gets a majority from their 1s, then you drop out the candidate with the fewest number 1s, and you look at those ballots, and you see which of the remaining 4 candidates they preferred second, and you reallocate those votes, and you keep dropping out the bottom person and reallocating their votes until somebody gets to a majority, okay? It is not the absolute dumbest way to run an election. That's the best thing I can say about it. Okay. You know, there's an argument if we had ranked choice voting in Kansas, we'd have a good for governor now. I'm not a huge fan of it, by and large. Okay. Some jurisdictions will try it. I believe in the American system. I believe in federalism. I'm willing to let some other states try it first. Let's see how they do. Let's see how it turns out. I don't think it has much of an effect this time. Well, one of the few states that has it is Maine. Maine really matters in the presidential election because Trump can get one electoral vote out of northern Maine. He's doing very well there. So I don't think it matters. There's a great scene you could call up online in my favorite television show, which is a British science fiction show called Doctor Who, where he's actually standing at Stonehenge and he's surrounded by, a billion alien races with 10 billion starships who are all crashing down on him. And he reminds them of all the times he's defeated them over the 50-year history of the show. And he says, so if you're up there and you're thinking about trying something, do the smart thing. Let somebody else try first. And they all run away. Do the smart thing. Let some other state try it first. Get about 10, 15 years of data, then we'll see. But I don't want to be first.
Mr. David Kensinger. And running